This is the provocation for the first Wired film. You will be working in groups of 4 or 5 groups in total from a class size of 21, to produce a 5-minute film. The provocation is the surreal, and in the following I have attempted to provide an overview of the surrealist movement, note a few techniques that you might wish to embrace in your film, and then offered up examples of short films that embrace the surreal in different ways. Following this, John Costello, who will be teaching the module alongside me, has provided 3 further short films for you to watch ahead of the first session. Please come to the first session ready to discuss these works. Links to all of them are provided below. Further reading and sources are also provided below. Please feel free to engage with these and more if you wish, but it is vital that you watch the following video and the short films. It was curious to note, scrolling through one of the timelines of art movements, comprised of vast temporal slabs of Western conformity, Baroque, Rococo, Neoclassical, and, later, briefer 20th century bursts of upheaval, symbolism, fauvism, expressionism, each assigned a moment of emergence and decline, that surrealism lacks a cut-off, being listed as from 1920s, which lends credence to the notion that it is not constrained by stylistic tics or is extinguished with the life or interest of its proponents, but rather that it is a means of expression that persists. In the Manifesto of Surrealism from 1924, poet André Breton offers up the following definition. Psychic automatism in its pure state, by which one proposes to express verbally, by means of the written word or in any other manner, the actual functioning of thought, dictated by thought in the absence of any control exercised by reason, exempt from any aesthetic or moral concern. As will be noted, such psychic automism in the 1920s was profoundly influenced by Sigmund Freud, whose 1899 work, The Interpretation of Dreams, was translated, expanded and disseminated over the following decade to the extent that Breton in 1924 found consensus amongst a growing body of artists for his assertion that the dreams of sleep are not inferior to the moments of waking. I was curious to interpose a contemporary form of automatism, a means of relinquishing control in the production of imagery, and turned to Crayon, a web-friendly implementation of the artificial intelligence engine DALL-E, a play on the name of the most celebrated surrealist, Salvador Dali, to summon forth surrealist toast. The results, combining everything the machine understands through analysing what it can find out about each of the 2 words, do indeed bear traces of stylistic tics. Elements of Miro, Ernst and Dali could be identified perhaps. What can be said is that none of these are wholly abstract, bringing us to the issue of what work is sur doing in relation to the surreal. The prefix is usually understood to mean over, above or in addition to that which follows. We have a different relationship to the real a century after Breton offered his definition of surrealism, from the hyperrealism of the last century to the virtually real of this. Yet its grounding in the material, the verifiable and the authentic persists, casting that which does not fall within its domain in a pejorative shadow, keeping it real, in real life, the real deal. Though he never used the metaphor in his writings, what has become popularized as the Freud iceberg illustrates the partial nature of the known, experienced in the waking moment world. The visible, agreed upon portion rests on a larger, unknown and potentially unknowable greater structure. And, without wandering too far into psychoanalysis, the illustration suggests how thoughts and perceptions keep down or keep hidden the substrata of instincts and fears, in Breton's terms, conforming to aesthetic and moral concerns. That which is suppressed and or unacknowledged comes to the surface in surrealist works, and recent moving image examples include much of David Lynch's work, the unsettling small-town evocations in Blue Velvet and Twin Peaks, or the unspeakable that sits alongside the humour of The League of Gentlemen. I'm going to iterate through a number of strategies associated with surrealism, some of which are closely associated with a particular form, but can, each in turn, be transposed and repurposed in the context of other media. In the course of this, I will be referencing key works that exemplify these approaches and how they have and might further act as a springboard to further revelations. Automatism. Automatic writing features prominently in Breton's manifestos of 1924, and in a later compendium, Manifestos of Surrealism, it is followed by a poetic text produced in his words through the process of pure psychic automatism. Entitled Soluble Fish, a prospect that itself troubles the rational mind, the text is not without those elements we would associate with poetry: metaphor, allusion, heightened language, yet moves forward without accreting around a fixed sensibility or ordering principle. This is the opening paragraph. The park, at this time of day, stretched its blonde hands over the magic fountain. A meaningless castle rolled along the surface of the earth. Close to God, the register of this chateau was open at a drawing of shadows, feathers, irises. The Young Widow's Kiss was the name of the country inn caressed by the speed of the automobile and the drapings of horizontal grasses. Thus the branches dated the year before never stirred at the approach of the window blinds, when the light sends the woman hurrying to the balcony. The young girl from Ireland, troubled by the Jeremiahs of the east wind, listened in her breast to the seabirds laughing. The above passage illustrates the tension in such works. We are a long way from the randomness of a million monkeys on a million typewriters aping the bard's output, and in its employment of particular phrases drawn from an evidently extensive body of possible words, one could be fairly confident that the exercise, undertaken by someone else, would exhibit their own particular learnings and preferences. The dictates of form, words arranged into coherent sentences, are as evident here as they are in what might be regarded as its closest painterly equivalent, Jackson Pollock's drip canvases. Though art history might request we lodge Pollock in the abstract expressionist camp, the remarkable canvases are clearly over, above, and in addition, commonly regarded as documenting an event rather than creating an image, or, as Pollock has it, the modern artist is working with space and time and expressing his feelings rather than illustrating. Broad slashes of the wrist dripping paint onto the canvas to fall where it will, Pollock then had to respond and reposition his next deposition of paint in response to the image that was forming beneath him. Exquisite Corpse. For the surrealists, whose literary origins soon expanded to the visual domain, early works in the field included those that adopted the strategy termed the exquisite corpse. Though there are many variations, and it did actually have its origins in sequential sentence construction, the enduring instances are those that divide the image into three sections: head, torso, legs, or four sections with the feet as the concluding element, with each section being completed by one person who folds, and thereby hides, their contribution so as not to influence that made by the next person. In the example here, the merest edge is visible to allow continuity of line, with the hybrid creature being the collective creation of, from top to bottom, Man Ray, André Breton, Yves Tanguy, and Max Maurice. It is not difficult to imagine how such a method might transpose itself into film, perhaps marking the divide between contributions not with an abrupt cut or intermediary still, but by tracking 180 degrees around the final frame with a dolly, and thus having the provocation be the same world from a different perspective. Collage. Assembling multiple materials in the production of representational space did not start with surrealism. nor indeed with Picasso and Cubism a few years earlier, even if this is where Western art often starts the lineage. The Surrealists pushed further towards the assemblages that precipitated the environments and happenings of the 60s by expanding the repertoire of gathered elements beyond textures and materials that contributed to still life canvases, such as Picasso's still life with chair caning of 1912, such as into signifying objects, newspaper clippings, found images, and more. If the Exquisite Corpse created a singular reality from the composite of multiple imaginings, Collage exploited the proliferation of multiple realities circulated by media and required the viewer to assimilate these into one representational space. Breton's Egg in the Church, or The Snake, not only in its conflicting title, but in the evident tension between religious iconography and the chiffon-clad allure of the female form below, proposes a world-view that does not abide by a division between the sacred and the profane. Technological advances facilitated collaging of images photographically, such as with the use of double exposure. Man Ray's The Lovers hints at the growing ease with which discordant and ostensibly unrelated elements can be fused together into a new reality. The disjunction between elements here is considerably less than on canvases that make a virtue of the differences between objects, and in a contemporary age where CGI is employed to eliminate such discontinuities, think of the fantastical rendered coherent such as Cassandra from Doctor Who, we might ask whether the surreal has taken flight and is now to be found elsewhere, or requires us to make the place of composition less seamless than is now actually possible. Dislocation and juxtaposition. One could unbundle a whole swathe of modern thought from the object here, Man Ray's The Enigma of Isidore Ducasse, a sculpture comprising wood, fabric, rope, cardboard, metal, offset on paper, and invisible object. It featured on the front of the first issue of the periodical The Surrealist Revolution in 1924, and was inspired by a line from Ducasse, otherwise known as Comte de Lautremont, describing a boy as beautiful as the fortuitous encounter of a sewing machine and an umbrella on a dissecting table. This was more than a turn from the natural world that might inspire the Romantics to capture the essence of beauty to the modern industrial world. It was reforging beauty in terms that prompted mental contortions on the part of the reader. What was this world in which these two elements might ever meet, and how might one reconcile this with an understanding of beauty? The line prompted Max Ernst to define the Surrealist painting as a linking of two realities that by all appearances have nothing to link them, in a setting that by all appearances does not fit them. The unlinked and unsuited is most evident in Surrealist sculpture, disturbingly in the case of Merritt Oppenheim's Object. It is difficult to regard the fur teacup without a degree of repulsion. Wittily in the instance of Dali's lobster telephone. And I use the term most evident consciously. Where Surrealist painting represents a world not bound by actuality, and time-based arts animate this world over a duration, sculpture resolutely persists, is of the world, even if it plays with the very expectations of what it means to be in the world. Where the enigma of Isidore Ducasse shows us the invisible object, his object to be destroyed, very obviously materially present, nonetheless offers no reason for its existence other than its disappearance. That, as with the implied demotion of the aura of the artist in writings created automatically, this was equally not a rejection of the aura of the art object, became apparent when, in 1957, a group of students dutifully destroyed the object, and Man Ray used the insurance to remake multiple copies of the work, renaming it Indestructible Object. That literal claim might also be tested can also be found in René Magritte The Treachery of Images, whose legend translates as "this is not a pipe," even as perhaps the one thing viewers might agree upon is the unarguable resemblance of the painted form to a pipe. The Wikipedia page on Surrealist techniques runs to 30 entries that you might wish to explore further. Here I'm going to move on to flag up the viewings for the first session. Un Chien Andalou. I have provided a link to Un Chien Andalou. It warrants a trigger warning. Contains bodily mutilation, forced sexual groping, mutilated animals. The visceral nature of the film, particularly its opening, is, I would argue, central to its aesthetic rather than gratuitous, and it is best viewed without even the preamble I am providing here. But if you wish to get a handle on this prior to watching, below I've provided a link to the IMDb guide that flags the moments that may unsettle. Though not the first surrealist film, Un Chien Andalou, an Andalusian dog, was made in 1929 by Salvador Dali and Louis Buñuel. Dali would go on to become the artist most associated with surrealism, producing perhaps its most celebrated work, The Persistence of Memory, with its promise of holding the viewer in a timeless reverie as temporal progression is arrested by the melting clocks. Dali's politics, which saw him expelled from the Surrealists in 1939, as well as his shameless commercial exploitation of his work, make him a problematic figure to the extent that, whilst undoubtedly one of the most visible artists of the 20th century, and, with Duchamp, Warhol, Beuys and Koons blurring the distinction between artist and work, his legacy is contested. Dali's co-writer and the director of Un Chien Andalou, Louis Buñuel, went on to become one of the most celebrated filmmakers of the 20th century, who, in full-length works such as The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie from 1972 and his final film, 1974's The Obscure Object of Desire, subversively lodged surrealist disquiet in the most polite echelons of society. Un Chien Andalou reinvigorated surrealism, with Dali's exuberance a counter to the rather sombre collective, deliciously illustrated in this photo taken at the opening of their group exhibition in Edinburgh in 1936. See if you can spot Dali. As the movement pushed against the geographical and ideological framing of Western European art, it not only disseminated the work further afield, but considered how it might engage with other cultures. Overtly, Breton and others showed their hand with a counter to the Exposition Internationale Coloniale of 1931, with an exhibition titled The Truth About the Colonies. In challenging the barbarism of the official exposition that coincided with the height of the French Empire, the Surrealists curated work from Africa, American and Asian cultures, juxtaposing them with, as here, strident commentary. Marx's declaration, a people who oppress others cannot be free. Art historian Partha Mitter captures the difficulties of framing, which, in spite of their intentions, the Surrealists struggle to surmount. Primitivism had an obvious emancipatory function in the narrative of modernism, but my question is, where is the agency of the primitive in this? Even surrealists imagined that tribal art expressed emotional states directly, failing to consider it as sophisticated art produced in its own ritual context. More importantly, where are contemporary black surrealists in the modernist narrative? Just as Breton's automatic writing cannot erase his proficiency with language and highly developed sense of the poetic, so too do we need to acknowledge that the absence of any control exercised by reason, exempt from any aesthetic or moral concern, does not fully escape the gravitational pull of one's own cultural collective perspective. Example 2. Afronauts. In a literal ascent into orbit, the next viewing melds the actual Zambian space program of the 1960s with the dream and alcohol-propelled imaginings of a community. Director Nuatama Francis Badoma observes that she and her team were interested in following characters that have not been able to find a home on Earth and are therefore most attracted to the promise of the space race. We are interested in talking about lack of access to science and different definitions of technological advancement. At every point where our irrational mind is noting the futility and preposterousness of the scenario, we are simultaneously acknowledging the way in which rationality conditions and constrains our thoughts. Example 3, Elephant. The third film makes a sly nod to arch-surrealist David Lynch in name-checking his film Elephant Man, and though it punctures the gravitas of that film, it is not averse to oscillating between humour and pathos. As with Afronauts, it works by sustaining an improbable premise, and the visual disjunction here achieves a critique of social alienation that would otherwise require a much longer, more verbose script. Example 4, Rejected. I began with the optimistic notion that surrealism's longevity arises from it being an approach that might evolve in response to the reality it confronts, rather than being reducible to stylistic quirks. It has, unsurprisingly, been assimilated and appropriated, such as in this VW ad, yet still has the potency to be regarded as, if not anarchic, then riotous, disturbing, and, in this instance, bitingly critical. I also made the point, perhaps elliptically, that it does require a familiar frame that it then disrupts, be it representational space or narrative expectations. Though here, as with Man Ray's Object Be Destroyed, it is liberating to note those moments when even that frame might collapse as that which is over, above, or in addition threatens to shatter the visible tip of the iceberg. John has suggested the following 3 texts. Example 5, Den offentliche Rust, the public voice. An animated odyssey beginning and ending on a painting by Belgian surrealist Paul Devers, taking in surrealist and wider art culture iconography, Da Vinci, Bosch, a literal voyage inside the art, fusing image and non-mainstream, somewhat challenging music, Berriot, David Hikes, Henry Cow, Mahler, in the pursuit of strong mental and emotional resonances. Example 6, Meshes of the Afternoon, Maya Deren and Alexander Hackenschmide's film from 1943. Dream logic given narrative form as Deren explores shared glitches in the matrix using cyclic events and repetitions of motifs. Fear is the key of the unknowable other, of the harmful potential of the subconscious self, of sexuality, detachment, and abandon, of the fragility of living, of troubled fate, of what lies behind the curtain. Example 7, Ghosts Before Breakfast. Experimental or avant-garde challenge to the rational world of order and consequence, deploying a mischievous compendium of effects with an underlying subtext of menace, all presented with an immaculate interior sense of timing and rhythm. The original score by Hindemith was destroyed in the Nazi purge of degenerate art. I prefer to watch with my own bespoke score, Kalkaroo by Startled Insects, which not only complements the images perfectly, but is also the exact same length. The dream state is elusive and often beyond recall upon waking, but dreams in their deepest, most lucid expressive form can appear as real as the waking state to the dreamer and can persist in the mind for a long time afterwards. Dream logic is most effectively reproducible through the medium of art and especially film, using combined techniques of camera framing, angle, placement and movement, editing, sound design, special effects, locations and constructed sets, production design, costume, props, dialogue and performance to explore automatism, extension, collage and dislocation juxtaposition, and to access subconscious or metaphysical states, emotions and feelings. That many of these states, emotions and feelings are unsettling, based in fear and trepidation, is unsurprising given the perilous political and social context of the time in which they were produced.